How's it going, everyone? Vlad here. Welcome back to this week's episode where we discuss different questions, different comments that we have coming in from our industry. We have 5 very interesting questions that we will be talking about. So without any further delay, let's get into it. And so the first question this week comes from the username of Froggy Mayo, and he says, my office desk for the week, spinning yarn machine conversion, Siemens ET 200SP plus Odot IO. There's a couple of interesting images, so here's his laptop on a spool of what seems to be cable. This doesn't seem to be a spool of yarn that we maybe see in the back. We got a very old panel, just a lot of different contactors, a ton of fuse blocks, some relays, and a lot of different I/O. I cannot even see where the PLC is. We have the actual machine. Again, surprising a little bit that he's posting this publicly. I don't believe that there's any intellectual property, but I've personally have always been told never post any customer information. So we have the machine that the customer is utilizing for spinning yarn. We have the new panel. I'm assuming that this is the new panel. This is the ET200 IO adapter, as I'm assuming, and that is where we have the Odot terminal blocks or IO blocks, which all land inside of this terminal strip where you can connect IO. It doesn't seem like there's anything connected on the opposite side of these terminals, which either there's maybe 2 terminals on the top and that's how they've connected to the field, but more likely there needs to be something that comes out of these blocks once the machine is commissioned. And he says, hello, just wanted to share my setup and current project keeping me busy on site this week. Nothing quite beats the classic cable spool desk. So there you go, that is a cable spool. When you're out on the floor, you can check out my highly ergonomic workstation. The project, I'm doing a complete control conversion on a massive spinning yarn machine. The old hardware was well overdue for a modern up. The before, we all know and love the classic spaghetti monster cabinets that come with these old textile machines. This one was definitely showing its age and made troubleshooting a nightmare to see what I was dealing with initially. The upgrade ripped out the old gear and migrating everything over to a new Siemens ET 200SP system. He didn't share what kind of a PLC he's using. Maybe he left the old PLC and this is just a remote I/O panel upgrade. Maybe he did move away from a different controller onto a more modern, either a 71200 or 1500 series. To handle the massive amount of I/O, we're using Odot digital input, digital output modules. This is very interesting. We'll come back to that in just a moment. You can see the new clean panel coming together. It is incredibly satisfying to go from decades of tangled wires to neatly tacked and labeled blue wiring. I'll check back in and update you in about 2 weeks with a full breakdown in a video of the machine completely up and running. Happy commissioning, everyone. So a couple of thoughts. Number one, like I said, he's not necessarily explaining which control system this is coming from. He is utilizing the ESP IO series from Siemens. This is very common for these types of applications for remote machinery. Maybe he's got a PLC that's controlling multiple pieces of equipment. That is also very plausible. And he's using the Odot IO, which is surprising. I would assume that you can pick the same catalog numbers out of the ET200SP modules. There might be some cost savings. I have not personally used the Odot hardware. It comes from China. There are documentation and manuals that you can download from their website. I was not overly impressed with just the quality of materials. Again, I'm assuming that once you have figured out how to properly integrate it into whichever control system, it probably works just fine. I can't imagine that the savings are that significant, but again, maybe this is a customer that is very price sensitive, so applaud to him for making sure that is handled. In terms of going back maybe to the first panel, so I did notice that there doesn't seem to be a controller, so maybe a lot of the I/O, and we can also tell that this is maybe a different panel. This is a green panel as opposed to what they've put in place. So I don't know if they replaced the entire cabinet. There doesn't seem to be a controller here. And even if I zoom in, I can obviously download the image and try and figure this out. There doesn't seem to be an actual controller. So maybe a lot of the wiring is coming from an auxiliary cabinet. We have the actual equipment. Oh, I stand corrected. It is the same green panel as we've seen in the past image. So it is remote I/O in this instance. I would assume it connects via Profinet to the main cabinet with the controller, as once again we do not have the controller. It looks like we've also cleaned up some of the other contacts that were already in place in the previous system. We have the there's at the bottom, we have a couple of fuse blocks, we have the relays, we have the large fuse blocks slash disconnects. So this is a job well done. We'll see what it will take, or if there's any challenges that he describes as he quote unquote updates us in a couple of weeks. And hopefully there will be a little bit more information on the system, as I have not personally worked on textiles. So this is definitely of interest and of curiosity, I would say, on my side. All right, and the second question or comment is going to be incredibly interesting. I do have multiple stories around this specific comment, so we're going to switch over and read the username's post. The username is the New Wave Order, and he says, customers said he loves to fix on his own. Now it is not working. And we have an image of a panel that is attached to the post. We can very quickly tell this is an older Siemens controller. We'll see the RS-232 protocol that supposedly, or I would assume, goes to an HMI. We can then notice multiple relays of different nature. A lot of them are 24 volts, which is a good sign. We have some Schneider relays as well sprinkled in, meaning that something has been definitely replaced over time. We have a couple of fused outputs, and so we have that tied to the field equipment. Overall, this is not a very complex panel, so if you were to reverse engineer something like this and migrate it to a new platform, probably a couple of weeks would be sufficient. We have the in-feed voltage coming in. We have some strange wiring, so wire nuts usually indicate the North American presence. So I would assume that this is a machine in North America, because in Europe you will see different style of clamps, even inside of equipment, but also on the residential space. It looks like we do have some drawings in the back, so maybe there is some hints or perhaps some tips as to what this looks like. And so we don't have anything else besides the image and this brief comment. And so, as I've mentioned, I do have a couple of stories from the industry. And so a lot of times as an automation systems engineer or control systems engineer, you get brought in to solve some of the problems that the customer was simply unable to resolve on his own. And so typically that means they probably have electricians on staff, they probably have engineers on staff that would be doing routine maintenance, perhaps some updates to the panels, perhaps upgrades and migrations from an old system to a newer one. But the reality is there's often just simply not enough work for them to do, so there aren't going to be large teams working on these unless you're working with a very large customer. At which point they normally bring you in. Of course, they would have preferred to have done it in-house as opposed to bringing in an external consultant or contractor. That's number one, usually is going to be more expensive and ultimately is going to know the process or what's going on at the plant level a little bit less. And of course, there's pluses and minuses in utilizing either resource. So there's going to be a long conversation to be had on whether or not you want to assign your internal electricians and engineers to something like this, or if you would like to bring in an external contractor. On one side, you have resources that are typically employees that need to be paid, that have already assigned work for them. On the flip side, you have a contractor that can be, in theory, fired depending on the clauses. I've seen a whole lot of different situations in my years, but ultimately there will be a time where you can just let them go because there is simply not enough work to work on these types of upgrades or fixes or what have you. Now, I've also seen many different customers that will decide to go the route of retrofitting a machine or fixing up a machine on their own. They will then fail for many months, usually sometimes decades, years, and then they will bring in that resource, not realizing how much time, how much effort, and ultimately how much was put in to try and fix this in-house, which would have otherwise been extremely inexpensive, comparatively speaking, to using a contractor or a consultant. So what I see a lot of very, I would say, inexperienced or younger, maybe engineering managers and directors miss is the fact that they are allocating human resources and capital first and foremost. So when you start to create a business case, whether we're going to do this in-house or whether we're going to bring in a contractor, you need to weigh in all the pros and cons, how long it's going to take, how much it's going to cost, what does the hire or the person is actually costing the company. Because if you assign resources, they spend a lot of time, this doesn't get fixed. Perhaps they do not have the skill set. Maybe you need someone a little bit more specialized. I've been in many projects where I would fly in and the customer would basically pay all lodging, transportation to make sure that the job is done right, correctly, because the resources that they have on staff are not sufficient to resolve some of these more complex engineering problems. What I have also found, and this is not always the case, but in certain instances, if you're in the shoes of an integrator, consultant, contractor, it is easier to let the end user fail and realize that they need you than to try and convince them before that happens. I've been in many projects or instances where I would make the argument that something needs to be changed or upgraded for XYZ reason. It could be obsolescence, it could be the fact that the part is not functioning as expected, it could be to reduce complexity of a specific system. They would of course shrug some of these suggestions, and then a couple of years later I would get a call, somebody else was trying to fix that problem, they were simply unable to do, and then they bring you in to, I would say, as a last measure to solve that problem. So again, when the customer says he loves to fix it on his own, that is great. Allow them to try that approach, and when things fail, they will be sure to call you. If you try to pressure them into signing a contract, my experience tells me that it is going to be very difficult to convince them of going through you, as opposed to, if their mind is set, going on their own.
Hi, my name is Vladimir Romanov. I am the founder of Joltek as well as Solus PLC. With a background in electrical engineering and an MBA and over a decade of experience leading projects in manufacturing and industrial automation, I help engineers, managers, and manufacturers make smarter technical and business decisions, modernize their operations, and build stronger careers. If you're serious about manufacturing, automation, and staying ahead in the industry, subscribe and join the community.
We've got a great learning question as the next one, and it comes from the username by the name, let's switch over here, Jik. And he says, teaching myself PLC basics, we see the image of a click. And he says, I'm an electrician that is required to screw around with PLCs and I hate it. I have a few laying around and have been trying to get basic system up and running so I can get more comfortable with the software and the function of the ports. I have played with the digital versions, but they're not as good for learning field or work time. Does anyone have advice on affordable device kits like photosensors, lasers, and related equipment I could order for a reasonable price to get my device working and interesting? In the end, I'm mostly going to have lights, motors, VFDs that don't accomplish anything, just set up and function experience that I can't go in the field and customer equipment. As for software, is there a PLC that can be flashed to use a variety of software, or would I need to buy specific PLCs to familiarize myself with each type of unit? I know it's a basic question, but even a bit of advice would help. Thank you. So this is a very good question. As many of you may know, I run a company and website called Solus PLC. I have been teaching PLCs for many years, I would say almost a decade at this point, and this question is extremely relevant to what I have been doing. So I'm going to just go back and maybe line by line address some of his questions. I'm an electrician that is required to screw around with PLCs and I hate it. That is an unfortunate statement. I really hope that he doesn't truly mean it. I think there's a lot of fun to the world of PLCs. That being said, I have worked with electricians that only prefer to stay with hardware, with wiring. They can even solve some of the mechanical problems. I would honestly, if you dislike this portion of your job, either push through and figure out what might be interesting, or talk with your managers and explain to them that you might want somebody else that helps you on some of these engagements, because to outright say that you hate PLCs is a bit of a strong statement. I have a few laying around, so he's already got a kit, I'm assuming, and he's looking to get more comfortable with the software. I have played with digital versions, but they're not as good for learning field work for me. Does anyone have advice on avoidable device kits like photosensors, lasers? So my general advice is that you can purchase very inexpensive hardware, as he describes, on AliExpress, Alibaba, and eBay. So a lot of the industry specific hardware gets sold for relatively cheap on those websites. However, what I will say is there's not a whole lot of value, at least in my opinion. Once you have wired up a couple of sensors, once you understood maybe a 4 to 20 milliamp loop, maybe a 0 to 10 type of a sensor, you've pretty much done all of it. I don't think there's a ton of information and experience you will get once you have wired in a couple of those field devices to and from the PLC. So I honestly would not spend a lot of money. I personally have a bunch of sensors laying around, and sometimes I will experiment with protocols and maybe some advanced things, but they do not necessarily have that much value once they have been set up. In the end, I'm mostly going to have lights and motors and VFDs. The value of VFD, if you want to spend the capital, I would recommend purchasing VFDs that you are going to set up for your customers. So this could be on the Rockwell side, it's the PowerFlex series. On the Siemens, it's the G series. A lot of different vendors are going to have VFDs. You can find ABB VFDs, Danfoss VFDs, so on and so forth. So there is some value in setting those up. I don't think that I would pay sticker price, as some of them could be a couple of thousands of dollars. Is it really worth it for you to get that hands-on experience? I don't think so. He asks for kits, and I wanted to give some advice not only on the kits when it comes to buttons and field devices on the PLC side. So he's got a Click PLC. This is known to be as one of the least expensive options in our industry. What I will say is, depending on the nature of your work, so if he's going out and has to deal with PLCs, I would try to, number one, ask your employer to borrow or to basically purchase a trainer PLC that is of the same variety as the one you're setting up. Of course, if that option is impossible, you can either spend your own money on either a Click PLC. I often recommend a Micrologix 1100 series PLC that you can purchase on eBay. It is no longer sold as it was discontinued a couple of years ago, but it still utilizes 500 free edition. That is a fantastic way to learn. He says, software is there PLC that can be flashed to use a variety of software, or would I need to buy specific PLCs to familiarize myself with each type of unit? And the unfortunate reality of our industry is that a lot of the PLCs are going to be hardware specific. So if you look behind me, I've got the Rockwell, I've got the Siemens, I've got the Automation Productivity, I've got an Opt Groove Rio, and all of them are going to be programmed differently. Now, it's not to say that it is impossible what you are describing, as we're seeing more and more vendors release what's called a virtual PLC. So in theory, you could buy an industrial computer and you could run a full PLC on top of that computer. It is not a simulation, so just to be completely clear, it is a full-blown PLC running typically within a Dockerized container that runs the full software from which you can control equipment. It is still in the early stages, so I guess the short answer is I would advise purchasing the PLC that you would normally see and or utilize in the field, so that it is as close as possible to what you would like to learn on that front. Basic question, it's a bit of advice would help. Again, don't hesitate to reach out if you're in a similar situation. Happy to give you some pointers. I know that some of these investments could be quite costly depending on the situation you are in. We've got a next interesting comment which comes from the Rover RZ. And They say, why is every PLC automation software a buggy, bloated mess? In my experience, I have yet to encounter a software that doesn't take an inexplainable amount of time to load, or have a random exception error with no explanation, or outright just closing randomly, or stopped working after a Windows update, or updating the software introduces new bugs, or the installation fails for some mysterious reason, or having to install 6 different software for being able to use the brand. Looking at you, Schneider. I have experience with Schneider, Mitsubishi, and all suffer from similar issues. And I certainly have my personal opinion on this topic. I left a comment in the section down below. My general thought is that number one, the softwares that we use in our industry, from all the vendors that he has described, are going to be challenging to build for a variety of reasons. Number one, it is fairly low volume. This is not a application that you run on your phone that is going to sell millions of copies where you have a ton of data from different users. Number two, the software is an engineering tool that is quite extensive. You need to start thinking about not just the software component, but also the fact that it interfaces with different ports. There's going to be different tools, from flashing, which is going to be an embedded level system, to building the software and compiling that down to binary for either a microcontroller or a variety of different controllers at the same time. I know that at least on the Rockwell side, some controllers will run the version of a mother, some are microprocessors, some are going to have redundancy. So we're talking about very different architectures and thus a lot of complexity. You can talk with those tools over you can talk over Ethernet, RS-232, 485, Data Highway Plus. All of those drivers are going to be contained within that software. And through a parallel, when we look at consumer grade software, if you were to, for example, release an iOS or an Android application today, in 2 years, that same application would be completely obsolete. Whereas in the industrial space, most of the vendors will relatively, I would say, support the controllers and components that come from the previous century even. So it is important to keep that in mind as we deploy some of these tools. To the comment on the Windows side, I would prefer personally that there was more software that is compatible with Linux. The reality of our industry is that for whatever reason, Windows is the OS of choice. However, it is important to understand that Windows also went through a variety of different migrations, so to expect the vendor that has released the software in 2002 to be compatible with the Windows version of today, but also compatible with controllers from the 1990s, is a fairly tall order. So all that being said, is I think that there is a unique challenge for our industry. Can things be done better? I would hope so, but it is of course a challenge for the vendors, for the hardware manufacturers. There's a lot to consider when it comes to PLC and automation software. The next question that we have comes from the visualization side. And so the user by the name Mob coming through says how to create HMI visuals like the photo with a 3D generated, what I would expect to be a factory IO type of an image with some settings, and we can see some kind of a CNC machine representation with a robot that I'm assuming is tending for that specific equipment. We have a few conveyor belts, and we have a lot, of course, safety guards with what I would assume lasers right at the entrance and the exit for safety purposes. And I have a couple of comments on this front. I don't particularly care for the nice 3D animations or visuals on HMI panels. Now, the other extreme, so if you're looking at some standards, there is a 101, which is basically the specifications as to how control rooms and HMIs should be designed, which typically leans towards the minimalistic side. And there's an argument to be made as to whether or not one is better than the other. Personally, I fall somewhere in the middle. I prefer more of a minimalistic design, but not as far as the SA 101 standards go. And what I generally mean by that is, number one, I would want a 2D representation and more I would say, flat icon visuals for this specific equipment. You can draw out the image right from the front, and you can show different sensors, different areas. You can even show the position of this specific robot, but too many visuals and too many 3D things happening could be extremely distracting. On the flip side, if everything is completely two-dimensional, you just see numbers, you're just seeing colors representing the conveyors running, I also believe that the HMI loses some vibrance and some, I would say, again, if you were to show up to that specific equipment and just look at the HMI, you should be able to understand what is going on. So to answer the question of the user, so how do you create HMI visuals like the photo? I'm assuming that this was a screenshot, like I said, that was taken from Factory IO. You can create all sorts of things in Blender, for example. You can create things in Solid. It is extremely time consuming. So are there companies that have built assets, and can you download examples of very specific machines? Absolutely. Is it worth it, your time? Is it going to make the HMI better? I don't believe so, unless there's maybe very specific reasons as to why you're going that route, or maybe it's a customer requirement. I don't think that this adds value for the time spent to create these assets. What I would spend more time on is, number one, functionality of the machine. Number two, thinking about the UI and the UX as it relates to either ISA 101 or if it's done outside of our industry. I have spent several basically years and have done projects on Android as well as iOS development, and I've referenced this in the past because those folks have employed scientists and individuals that spent many years researching what makes a good screen, what makes a good UI, what makes good buttons, what color scheme to choose. And I think that actually adds value into our industry because it will make the HMI screens a lot more accessible for the operators, reduce the learning curve, and thus truly add value to the specific system. We've got a last question, which is interview related. This is important for our industry. I think there's not enough questions being asked like this, so it is my pleasure to answer this user, which is Tyeth. And they say, job requires PLC knowledge. How can I impress during an interview? I'm interviewing for a position tomorrow. My friend who works there got me this interview by passing my resume after he heard I was finishing my degree in data science. He said that they need a programmer. I asked the position name and it said data engineer or something of the sorts, but I never saw a job listing anywhere. I asked what I should need to know and he told me PLCs. I've worked with PLCs a little in the past and currently brushing up using the resources that are panned, but if PLCs are brought up, how can I impress during an interview? What would be good questions to ask about their internal systems with PLCs? And then he made an edit again. I don't know if this was at the beginning of the post or post a couple of comments. And he says, okay, defined, I did not word well. I'm not trying to lie. I'm trying to show that I'm not completely clueless when it comes to PLCs. I don't have the experience with PLCs, and they should have been able to tell that by looking at my resume. I don't think I want someone who is creating the PLC. I don't think they want someone who is creating the PLCs. I assume they already have a lot of people who do that. But like others said, I was able to show interest in their systems and the willingness to learn. I think they want someone who can export and process the data of the PLCs. There's a lot of confusing information. I will be honest, as I read through that question, this edit actually seems to be detracting from the main question that I had assumed was being asked. But let's go through this line by line. How can I impress during an interview? So once you are selected for an interview, and this is a misconception that I used to have in the past, you need to understand whom it is that you are talking with, who's interviewing you. In most cases, you are not being assessed at a technical level. Once you are brought on site, it means that they have reviewed your resume. They understand very well what your experience and knowledge level is. They have already, and you've mentioned this a little bit later in the comment, they know that you don't know PLCs very well. They understand that you have just graduated, and at best, maybe a PLC was mentioned. I probably would assume that you would take a little bit of time to understand the general landscape of PLCs, but I don't think that they would expect you to come in fully knowing about PLCs, being able to answer questions. So personally, if I was interviewing you, I would be a lot less concerned about very specific technical knowledge, which we both know you do not have in this specific instance. What I would be looking for is, number one, a person that is very curious, that is excited to be working for this specific team, department. Again, obviously there's no mention of this, but is curious about the general technology of industrial automation, is generally curious about the company, and shows some curiosity during the interview. We'll get into the questions in just a moment. Number two, you want to be very safety conscious oriented, in my opinion. These systems are very different than what you would normally be trained for in software or data science or even electrical engineering. So when I'm talking to a newly minted engineer or technician, I want to make sure that they have at least some appreciation of the dangers going onto the plant floor for the process, for the electrical panels, and that they can be trusted not to put themselves in danger and the rest of the team in danger. The next point, very important, I would obviously spend some time knowing the general information around PLCs, but try to find maybe some information as to the company's utilization of PLCs, control systems. I would ask questions such as, what kind of control systems are you utilizing? If you're unable to find that online, I would talk to them about the different hardware solutions when it comes to PLCs, maybe HMIs. I would ask them questions. How do you collect the data from the PLCs right now? Where do you store the data? There's going to be a lot of nuances. I've already made tons of videos on this channel, but basically you can spend a lot of time just being curious, since you're going to come in on the data science side, about what kind of data are they collecting, what kind of data are they storing, where are they going to store it, and what kind of format, what kind of a historian are they going to use, what is going to be done with this data, who's going to ultimately benefit from having this information. Maybe they're looking to just monitor a couple of pieces of their own hardware if they're a machine builder. Maybe they want to give the client access to a full telemetry suite of different products. But conversely, maybe they're building out a data capability that allows them to leverage AI. It is all very unclear. So if your bread and butter, and if you're looking to spend more time on data, you should probably ask a lot of questions on that side. I would not try and impress them by reciting some obscure knowledge of PLCs. I don't think that anyone likes a know-it-all in a very broad sense of that word. You should be asking questions that truly interest you. Talk about different projects. Ask them about what do they have lined up in the next 6 months, in the next year, maybe a couple of years. How could you most benefit the company and organization? What is the learning curve like if you were to join that position? How can you best support them, but also how can they best train you on some of these best practices? All of those questions demonstrate interest, ability, but also the human side of yourself. You're not there to just solve technical problems. You're probably going to work with other counterparts, mechanical engineers, process engineers, other data scientists, managers, operators and technicians if this is an end user, or assembly workers if this is a machine builder. So you need to demonstrate not only the technical expertise, but at least the ability to communicate with your peers and potential colleagues in the company.